under certain conditions your body will carry out anaerobic respiration, and that's what we're going to look at today for this video for AQA GCSE Unit 2 Biology. Now in the previous example we talked about aerobic respiration and how we require oxygen for that to happen. Sometimes if you are carrying out very heavy or very vigorous exercise, you don't get enough oxygen going to the muscles to supply them to carry out their aerobic respiration. What happens then is your body will carry out this process, or your muscles will carry out this process called anaerobic respiration, and the equation for that is as follows. We have glucose that gets converted to a substance called lactic acid, and you get a little bit of energy. Okay, so this substance is produced for anaerobic respiration. It's a toxic substance, so you don't want it to be hanging around for too long, and you get your little bit of energy. Now, what's the reason why that happens? Well, the glucose during aerobic respiration, so this is an example of aerobic respiration. The glucose is broken down in many steps into CO2 and water. This is for aerobic respiration. Now, during that process, at various points, energy is released. And by the time you get to the end of it, a lot of energy is released. But the only problem is this whole section of the breakdown of glucose requires oxygen, and if you don't have any oxygen present, you can only carry out really these first two steps, and that means we only get a little bit of energy produced. And in actual fact, at the end of the step here, we got glucose, we go off this branch of chemical reactions, and we make lactic acid. So really this is slightly more detail than you need, but it might help you to understand why this process happens. So what you really need to be worried about is this equation here. Glucose goes to lactic acid plus a little bit of energy if there's not enough oxygen around. Now, what tends to happen when you get a build-up of this lactic acid, which is toxic, which is poisonous, is you have fatigued muscles. In other words, you have tired muscles, and they stop contracting efficiently, so they don't contract as well as they used to, and they become very tired, and this lactic acid has to be removed. So if you imagine this muscle here is being strenuously exercised during this run, we get a build-up of lactic acid. What has to happen is the blood has to flow through the muscle and remove that lactic acid. And if you've ever done any sort of heavy exercise, maybe lifting weights or something like that, sometimes you feel a burning sensation in the muscles, and that's due to the presence of this substance called lactic acid. Okay, so anaerobic respiration, glucose is converted to lactic acid, which is toxic. That causes the muscles to feel tired, and it has to be removed by the blood from the muscle. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is on the higher tier. However, do feel free to watch if you're not doing the higher tier. You can just watch along if you want to. Now, what happens during anaerobic respiration, in slightly more detail, is as follows. We have the build-up of lactic acid as a result of heavy exercise. So you've got a lot of lactic acid, and we know this is poisonous, and we remove it from the muscle with the blood flowing through it. But while it's removed from the muscle, it's still in the blood, it still has to be removed. So what happens then is we have a process called oxidation, and that process is driven by oxygen. So oxygen will come along and oxidize the lactic acid, and this actually explains why after a period of heavy exercise you carry on breathing for quite a while afterwards, because what you're trying to do is to supply the oxygen to oxidize the lactic acid to get rid of it, and we call this the oxygen debt. So what you're doing is you're kind of repaying the oxygen to your body in order to remove this substance called lactic acid. Once that oxygen comes along, the lactic acid can then go along that series of chemical reactions I mentioned previously, and then be converted into carbon dioxide and water, which can be gotten rid of from the body in the usual way. So in summary, after a period of heavy exercise, your the muscles may carry out anaerobic respiration, and that builds up lactic acid. Oxygen is used to oxidize that lactic acid, which means to break it down and remove it. We end up with carbon dioxide and water, and after a period of heavy exercise you often carry on breathing for a while, and we call that the oxygen debt.